Hi again, and welcome back to another Let's Do This video. Today I'm going to be talking about a section of my introduction that outlines the response to an increase in people of color in universities in the mid-1940s to the 1950s that is often talked about in the field of composition. Specifically, I'm going to talk about this in conjunction with the nationwide response to the GI Bill. I'm connecting these two concepts because of a trend I tend to see in composition studies of briefly glossing over a particular moment in our history and talking about the compositionist response to that moment in history without considering the larger cultural and historical context of the day. The social response to this event, as well as that academic compositionist response. So let's take a minute to think about what the GI Bill was, and then we can transition to thinking about the compositionist response and how those two things in contact with each other change how we should be thinking about this era in our composition history. What politicians at the time may not have considered is that for particular populations of American citizens back in the 1940s and 50s, there were certain roadblocks in place to become functioning members of a society that was designed to hold certain members of that society back, particularly people of color and most explicitly members of the Black community in the United States were held back from interacting with and benefiting from the parts of the GI Bill that were designed to assist people who needed them the most. One of the most poignant examples of this is the housing loan opportunity that was essentially the main function of the GI Bill. For the most part, there were, whether they were legitimate or subversive systems in place that prevented people of color from taking out loans of any kind. This was not exclusionary towards housing loans. And I will be censoring myself a bit when I read this title, in Lewis Lee Woods II's text, Almost No Black Veteran Could Get a Loan, African Americans, the GI Bill, and the NAACP Campaign Against Residential Segregation, Woods breaks down the fact that for the most part, it was almost impossible for people of color, specifically black men, to get loans post-World War II. Those black men were denied loan opportunities regardless of their savings, their monthly income, their yearly income, the ability to provide a down payment or not, family size, any reason that a loan distributor or bank could consider, in part thanks to Jim Crow-era racist regulations. Of course, these things not being strict laws as much as societal roadblocks that were agreed upon culturally. In the text, Woods outlines a family and a father who made, I want to say it was twice as much as the required down payment for a house, and it was simply denied because the bank refused to loan out money to a black man. He met every check mark for getting a loan, even before the GI Bill, yet this bank, his area where he lived, would not allow him to do so. A direct result of racist, not theories, sorry, of racist mentalities at the time. Further from this, we get organizations like the Federal Housing Association that strictly marked particular areas of the communities that people were trying to move to as less valuable, as less desirable, the more people of color existed there. They also, of course, marked areas where people of color could not exist. We think of Levittown as the main example of this, but there were plenty of other whites-only residential areas that appeared after World War II and during World War II. But these places were strictly designed so that people of color who were able to move financially and socially in a distance they had never been able to move before could not enter into particular areas of the country, directly ensuring a segregationalist look at housing, at the GI Bill, at the work that these veterans put into play. As these discriminatory practices were occurring that were preventing people of color from accessing this bill at the same rate as their white counterparts, compositionists were enacting, I don't want to say enacting, as much as they were in their current traditionalist era. Let's make it sound artistic. This era of composition was defined by its focus on the writing itself rather than the writer and their individual histories and needs as composers. Specifically, a la Berlin and Inkster in 1980, the final product was the end goal of current traditionalism. What the text itself looked like, how it was organized, and its grammatical structure were the tippy top of what was important to current traditionalists, to most compositionists of the day. At its core, the idea of focusing on producing the best, most legible product with a certain idea of good writing, good grammar, and good structure in mind is problematic at best, because it is not considerate of the individual in the classroom, who they are, where they're coming from, and what their background in writing is. But when we consider the fact, especially at this time, that there were more people entering the university who were unfamiliar with the ins and outs of existing at a majority white space, with particular ideas about good writing, good reading, good ways of communicating in mind, this approach to composition became harmful, not just problematic. Both as a reactionary way of doing pedagogy and as simply a way of thinking about the writers who were entering into the university. Now, what do I mean by that? Firstly, it's worth pointing out that current traditionalism was harmful not just to folks of color, but to folks coming from lower income backgrounds, white individuals who were maybe not privy to the types of education that generational college families were privy to, farming families, people from areas of the country that didn't have access to much in the way of literature, physical books, money, the ability to travel to colleges, things like that. This did not just affect people of color, current traditionalism specifically, but that is who I'm trying to focus on here, because traditionally there is no focus on this group almost at all when we're talking about current traditionalism. The response to this influx of people of color and people from lower income backgrounds, as discussed by Paul K. Matsuda in 2006, was the opportunity, as was seen by the compositionists at the time, to separate the wheat from the chaff, in other words, by linguistically containing those with markers of lower linguistic skill, as it would have been referred to at the time, into remedial composition and writing classes that were separate from the main English courses that were given a level of hierarchical importance. These courses were designed to drill into folks the basics of grammar, structure, and even vocal communication that would help these otherwise linguistically separate, linguistically different, linguistically othered members of society fit into the college environment. But it's important to keep in mind that this approach was not philanthropic, as much as it was a response to what scholars at the time might have seen as a problem, a sickness, a plague upon academia. The important connecting point, then, that is often glossed over is, traditionally, in the era of current traditionalism, we saw a group of people who were not as linguistically similar to the folks we were used to working with, upper to middle upper class white men. And instead of changing our expectations, of rethinking the ways that people can communicate academically, we discriminated. We decided that instead of changing our ideas, they needed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps to learn different ways of speaking and communicating that were seen as more socially within the university ways of communicating and existing. We needed to refine these people coming into our university spaces because they were ours, and we would not change for them. They would change for us. This is highly problematic, but it becomes even more so when we consider that the folks who were able to get to college, who relied on the GI Bill, who were the main catalyst for these linguistic containment classrooms, these Composition 100s, were already facing discrimination at a social, cultural, national level. And when they were able to hurdle over these obstacles, to actually walk through the doors of a college that otherwise would never have even considered them as options, were then told they were not good enough. They were then told that they were weak, that they needed to change and learn just to get to the basic level of understanding and communicating. They weren't refined enough. They weren't cultural enough. I say these phrases that almost physically hurt me to repeat in this way because it's important to consider the harm that this moment did on people of color and, as I said, lower income white members of society who entered the college space. Because no matter what, people of color specifically were fighting against seemingly impossible odds just to be able to exist, even when in 1944 Congress gave them the largest of air quotes around the term gave them, provided an opportunity for upward social movement, upward financial movement that they never would have had otherwise. This era is so tinged with anti-black and anti-person of color racism that we don't talk enough about its direct impact. We detach how meaningful the further discrimination of placing people of color in remedial classes must have been to their understanding of the place in society. We ignore the pain we inflicted, and we talk about it almost medically. We moved these people into other classes to help them, to give them the skills they needed. this move is framed as a form of discrimination. But composition studies tends to couch it as a separate form of discrimination from the generalized racism of the day that put these students in a position of not having the skills they needed to move forward in society. It very much was not a different form of discrimination or racism. It was a symptom of that larger disease. This is the important step I'm trying to make. We tend to do this with our history. We tend to whitewash what our field did when our field did it. We specifically talk about the GI Bill as a moment of changing our field, of almost a second birth of our field, without interrogating what actually was happening to people of color because of the GI Bill, without interrogating the fact that the influx of these students was only because they were willing to risk their lives for their country. A country that placed them on the front lines in part because of literacy tests that they, of course, failed, because those literacy tests were designed with upper-class white men in mind, the people who eventually made their way to officers in the field. At all moments in American history, but in all moments of the composition history that I'm speaking of, people of color were assaulted with the expectations of academics who found them to be distasteful, who found their knowledge to be lacking. And that's something we need to be more transparent about. People of color entered the university spaces in the post-World War II era, and they were met with linguistic discrimination at the most basic level. Their knowledge of grammar, their knowledge of the canon was, of course, different than that of the folks who had been privy to that knowledge for generations. So composition flourished, in part due to this discrimination. And it flourished in a way that directly discriminated against them, without interrogating why that was. Because, of course, as I mentioned before, this era was about the product, not the process, and not even the writer. Their writing was defunct, when in reality, we were telling them that they were. An important note before I wrap up today. I am taking on the persona of these scholars because it is impossible for me to separate my whiteness from this discussion. As I tend to do for the rest of these videos, I will place myself in the shoes of the oppressor. My whiteness is a huge part of my research. I separate it from my identity as a lower class individual, because I can sort of walk the walk and talk the talk of an upper class white dude. But it is important to acknowledge that. I am choosing to acknowledge my place in this history as an oppressor. While I was not a college professor in the 1940s. I look good for my age, but not that good. While I was not this person, I still inevitably would have benefited from it at the time. My whiteness, that is. So I have to acknowledge this. And I'm doing so by framing myself as the oppressor. By saying we instead of they. I think this is important for me and for the field to consider the ways that a lot of our ideas, a lot of our beliefs, are founded in these hidden racist histories. And the GI Bill and this history of current traditionalism is an important step to beginning to acknowledge that reality. Thanks for watching.